The twin moons cast silver light across the crystal towers of the eternal court as Empress Valeria Nightwhisper sat upon her ancient throne and her massive dragon. Shadowfang lay coiled beside her like a mountain of scales and ancient power that had not moved for battle in 300 years. A messenger burst through the great doors, and his face was pale with shock as he bowed low before the Empress and spoke words that made the entire court fall silent. Princess Liana had returned after 20 years of absence, and she was not alone. Valeria felt something shift in her chest after 2 decades of wondering if her daughter lived or died, and now she was coming home. But the messenger spoke of companions, and the Empress knew her daughter would not return without reason. The landing platform filled with nobles and warriors as a small ship descended from the stars, and the crowd whispered among themselves about where the princess had been and why she had abandoned her duty so long ago. The ship doors opened and Princess Liana stepped out, and she looked older now with lines around her eyes that spoke of hardship and joy in equal measure, but she stood tall and proud as she had always been. Beside her walked a human male, and the crowd gasped because humans were known to the Empire, but only as distant warriors from a primitive sector that waged constant wars among themselves. The man had brown hair and steady eyes, and he held himself like a soldier who had seen many battles. But the most shocking sight came next. 2 children emerged from the ship, and they were neither fully elven nor fully human, but something in between, with pointed ears that were shorter than pure elves and eyes that held both ancient wisdom and youthful fire. The boy looked about 10 years old, and the girl perhaps 8, and they held hands as they walked beside their parents and stared at the magnificent city with wonder and fear mixed together. Empress Valeria descended from her throne, and Shadowfang stirred for the first time in years as the ancient dragon lifted his massive head to study the newcomers with eyes like burning gold. The Empress walked through the parted crowd until she stood before her daughter, and the 2 women looked at each other across 20 years of silence and unspoken pain. Liana bowed deeply and then straightened to meet her mother's gaze without flinching as she spoke clearly so all could hear. "This is Carter Blake, and he is my husband. And these are our children, Elena and Marcus." The court erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations, because such a union was not forbidden, but it was unheard of, and the children should not exist according to all known laws of biology. Valeria stared at the 2 young ones, who looked back at her with curious eyes that reminded her so much of Liana when she was young, and yet they also held something else, something uniquely human in their expressions. The Empress spoke, and her voice carried across the silent plaza with the weight of millennia behind every word. "Are these my grandchildren?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, and Liana opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, a terrible sound split. The sky alarms blared across the capital, and red lights flashed from every tower as defense systems activated and soldiers rushed to their stations with practiced efficiency. A fleet had appeared in orbit, and it was massive beyond anything the Empire had seen. In a century of peace, the Dominion of Ash had come, and they had brought enough ships to burn entire worlds. Valeria turned to her military commanders, who stood frozen in shock, and she barked orders that sent them running as Shadowfang rose to his full height and roared a challenge that shook the crystal towers. The dragon spread wings that could cover a city block and launched himself into the sky as fire gathered in his throat. Carter grabbed his children and pulled them close as explosions began to rain down on the outer shields, and the peaceful city transformed into a war zone in seconds. Liana drew a blade that glowed with ancient magic, and she stood ready to defend her family and her home. Valeria looked at her daughter, and then at the human and his children, and she made a decision that would change the course of history. Get them inside and bring them to the war room. Now guards surrounded the family and rushed them into the palace as the first Dominion ships broke through the outer defenses and began their assault on the capital. In the war room, Valeria stood over a holographic display that showed the enemy fleet in terrifying detail, and she counted hundreds of ships, all bearing the mark of the Dominion, a burning skull wreathed in black flames. Her generals argued about tactics and strategies, but Valeria held up her hand for silence and turned to Carter, who stood calmly despite the chaos around him. "You are human, and your people have fought the Dominion before. So tell me what we face." Carter stepped forward and studied the display with the eye of someone who had seen such horrors before, and his voice was steady as he spoke. That is not a raid or a random attack. But this is an extermination fleet, and they have come to wipe out your entire species? The room fell silent, and Valeria felt cold dread settle in her bones as she asked the question that terrified her: why now? And why? US Liana stepped forward and placed her hand on her husband's shoulder as she looked at her mother with eyes full of sorrow and guilt. Because of me, and because I brought Carter here, and because our children exist. The Empress stared at her daughter and demanded answers as explosions rocked the palace foundations. Liana took a deep breath and began to tell a story that had been hidden for 20 years, and it was a tale of war and love and a conspiracy that threatened every living being in the galaxy. 20 years ago, she had been sent to investigate human expansion in the outer sectors, and she had found a colony world under attack by Dominion forces who were slaughtering civilians without mercy. She had violated orders and intervened with her dragon Starfire, and together they had saved thousands of lives, including Carter, who had been leading the desperate defense. In the aftermath, they had formed an alliance to discover why the Dominion hunted humans so viciously, and what they found had horrified them both. The Dominion had created a biological weapon, and it was a virus designed to target specific genetic markers, and humans were immune carriers who could spread the plague to other species without knowing. The plan was to use humans as walking weapons to wipe out entire civilizations, while the humans themselves never knew they were infected. Carter and Liana had spent years fighting to stop this plan, and in that time they had fallen in love and married in secret, and their children were born on a hidden world far from both their peoples. But now the Dominion knew they had returned, and they were using it as an excuse to attack the Elven Empire while claiming it had been contaminated by human presence. Valeria listened to this tale with growing horror, and she looked at her grandchildren with new understanding. These children were not just a union of two species, but they were living proof that the Dominion's virus could be stopped, because their mixed blood showed that elves and humans could coexist without triggering the plague. The Dominion could not allow such proof to exist, and so they had come to destroy it along with everyone who knew the truth. Another explosion shook the palace, and alarms screamed that the inner defenses were failing. Shadfang's roar echoed across the city as the ancient dragon battled enemy ships, but even his power could not hold back an entire fleet alone. Valeria looked at her daughter and her human son-in-law and her impossible grandchildren, and she made a choice that would either save her empire or doom it forever. She turned to her shocked generals and gave an order that made them all stare in disbelief. Give command of the dragon riders to the human. The dragon riders stood in formation before Carter Blake, and their faces showed nothing but contempt and distrust as the human walked among them with calm confidence, despite the hatred burning in their ancient eyes. Commander Iris Thornwood stepped forward, and she was the oldest rider present, with silver hair and scars that spoke of 1,000 battles won. She looked at Carter with disgust and spoke words that echoed what every elf in the room was thinking: we do not take orders from humans, and especially not from a primitive warrior who knows nothing of dragon bonding or aerial combat. Carter met her gaze without flinching, and his voice carried across the assembly hall with quiet authority. You are right that I know nothing of your ways, but I know war, and I know the Dominion, and right now that knowledge is what will keep you alive. The riders murmured among themselves, and some reached for their weapons, but Empress Valeria's voice cut through the tension like a blade of ice. He commands, because I say he commands, and anyone who disobeys will answer to me and to Shadowfang. The great dragon stood behind the Empress, and his golden eyes fixed on each rider until they bowed their heads in reluctant submission. Carter turned to the holographic display that showed the battle raging in the skies above the capital, and he began to explain tactics that made the elven warriors shift uncomfortably. The Dominion fights in tight formations because they rely on overwhelming firepower and concentrated attacks, but your dragons are faster and more maneuverable, so we will use that. He pointed to weak spots in the enemy fleet and explained how small strike teams could penetrate their defenses and cause chaos from within, while the main force kept them occupied from the front. Iris listened despite herself, and she realized the human was not speaking like a primitive barbarian, but like a master strategist who had faced these enemies Before what of honor and what of facing our enemies directly rather than striking from shadows like cowards? Carter turned to her, and his eyes held a sadness that came from too many losses and too many friends dead because of honor. Honor does not feed your children when you are dead, and it does not rebuild cities after they burn, and the Dominion does not care about honor, so neither can we if we want to survive. The words stung, but they rang with truth that could not be denied. Young Elena stepped forward, and her voice was clear despite her fear as she spoke to the assembled riders. Please trust my father, because he saved my mother once, and he can save all of us. Now Marcus stood beside his sister, and the two children looked so small among the ancient warriors, but there was something in their eyes that commanded respect. Suddenly Marcus gasped, and his eyes went distant as if seeing something far away, and when he spoke his voice sounded older than his year. Starfire comes, and she brings others. The great doors burst open, and Princess Liana strode in with her dragon companion, and behind her came 3 wild dragons that had never been bonded to riders before. The dragons entered the hall, and their presence filled the space with raw power as they studied the assembled elves with intelligent eyes. Elena walked forward without hesitation, and she approached a massive silver dragon whose scales gleamed like moonlight, and the beast lowered its head to study the child. The riders watched in stunned silence as the girl reached out and touched the dragon's snout, and a bond formed that should have taken years of training and preparation. The silver dragon rumbled deep in its chest, and its voice entered every mind in the room like thunder. I am Frostwind, and I choose this child as my rider. Iris fell to her knees, and tears streamed down her face, because, well, dragon bonding had not occurred in over 5 centuries, and it was considered the highest honor that could be bestowed. Marcus approached a bronze dragon with eyes like fire, and the same impossible bond formed as the dragon named itself Ember and accepted the boy as its companion. Carter watched his children climb onto their dragons, and pride and fear warred in his heart, but he knew they were meant for this moment. Valeria stepped forward and addressed her riders with renewed conviction. You have seen what these children can do, and they carry blood from both our peoples, and perhaps that is our greatest strength, not our greatest weakness. The riders stood and saluted, and even Iris bowed to Carter with grudging respect. Now teach me your ways so I can teach you mine. The next hours passed in frantic preparation as Carter learned the basics of dragon combat while teaching the riders his unconventional tactics. They practiced maneuvers that violated every rule of honorable warfare, including feints and ambush and hit and run attacks that seemed cowardly but were devastatingly effective. Elena and Marcus took to flying as if they had been born to it, and their dragons moved with them in perfect harmony that made veteran riders shake their heads in amazement. The combined force launched into battle, the sky filled with dragons and fire, and the Dominion fleet suddenly found itself facing an enemy that fought unlike any they had encountered before. Carter coordinated the attack from Shadowfang's back with Valeria beside him, and together the ancient Empress and the human warrior directed their forces with precision that began to turn. The tide. Dragon riders struck from unexpected angles and disappeared before the enemy could respond, and Carter's human tactics combined with elven magic created chaos in the Dominion ranks. Elena and Marcus flew together, and their young voices rang out over the communications network with warnings and encouragement that inspired the veteran warriors. Frostwind breathed frost that froze enemy ships solid, while Ember's fire melted through armor like paper. The battle raged for hours, and slowly the Dominion advanced ground to a halt and then began to retreat. Victory seemed within reach, and the riders cheered as enemy ships fled back into orbit. But Carter felt cold dread settle in his stomach as he watched the retreat, because it was too easy and too organized. This was not defeat, but this was a planned withdrawal. He turned to Valeria and spoke urgently. This was a distraction, and the real attack is happening somewhere else. The Empress understood immediately, and she reached out with her mind to touch every dragon in the Empire. Where is the world tree? The answer came back from distant scouts, and it sent ice through every elven heart. The sanctuary was under attack, and a stealth team had penetrated the defenses while everyone was focused on the capital. The world tree was the source of all elven magic, and if it died, the entire empire would follow within. Days Valeria looked at Carter and Liana and her grandchildren, and she spoke with quiet desperation. "We must go now, and we may already be too late." Shadowfang roared and launched himself toward the distant sanctuary with Starfire and Frostwind and Ember. Following close behind below them, the wounded capital celebrated victory while having no idea that their entire civilization hung by a thread. Carter held onto the dragon's scales and prayed they would arrive in time, while knowing in his heart that the Dominion had planned this perfectly. Race against extinction had begun. The world tree rose from the planet's surface like a living mountain, and its branches stretched into the clouds while roots delved deep into the world's core, and every leaf glowed with magic that sustained the entire elven empire. Shadowfang descended through smoke and fire as the sanctuary burned around the ancient tree, and bodies of guardian warriors lay scattered across the sacred ground where no violence had occurred for 1,000 years. Carter leaped from the dragon's back before they fully landed, and he rolled to his feet with weapons drawn as enemy soldiers turned to face the new threat. Liana fought beside him, and her blade sang through the air as she cut down Dominion troops who had defiled her people's most holy place. Valeria strode through the chaos like a force of nature, and her magic tore through enemy ranks while Shadowfang's fire turned their vehicles into molten slag. Elena and Marcus landed their dragons and joined the battle despite their parents' shouted protests. Because the children could feel the world tree's pain through their strange connection to all living things, the sanctuary's inner chamber lay ahead, and massive doors had been blown open by explosives that left scorch marks on walls that had stood unmarked for millennia. Inside the chamber, a figure stood before the world tree, and his hands worked on a device that pulsed with sickly green light. The man wore the uniform of a Dominion admiral, but his face was human, and when he turned to face them, Carter felt recognition slam into him like a physical blow. Kane Brooks had been his best friend and his brother-in-arms during the early wars against the Dominion until the day Kane's ship was captured, and everyone assumed he had died, but Kane lived, and whatever the Dominion had done to him had twisted his mind until only their programming remained. Kane smiled, and it was a cold expression that held no warmth or recognition. "So they sent you, Carter, and after all these years we meet again, but you are too late because the device is already active." The machine beside Kane hummed with power, and green liquid began to flow through tubes that pierced into the world tree's bark. Valeria stepped forward, and her voice shook with rage. "What have you done?" Kane gestured to the device with pride. "I have delivered justice because your species and all the others are inferior and weak, and only humanity deserves to inherit the stars." Carter shook his head, and desperation filled his voice. "Kane, listen to me, because you were captured and they did something to your mind, but you are not this person, and you were never this person." For a moment something flickered in Kane's eyes, and confusion crossed his face before the cold mask returned. "I am the Purge, and I am the Dominions will made flesh, and I will cleanse the galaxy of all lesser beings." Marcus suddenly cried out and fell to his knees as visions flooded his mind, and he saw possible futures branching out in every direction. In one future, the elves died and humanity celebrated before the Dominion turned on them and wiped out every human world. In another future, the humans were destroyed first and the elves followed soon after because the Dominion served only death. But there was one future where both species survived, and it required a sacrifice that Marcus could barely comprehend. The boy struggled to his feet and spoke through gritted teeth. "The poison is spreading, but we can stop it, and we are the cure." Elena understood before anyone else, and she looked at her brother with wide eyes. "Our blood?" Marcus nodded, and Liana grabbed her children as understanding and horror warred in her heart. "No, and there has to be another way." But Valeria knelt beside her grandchildren, and she looked into their eyes and saw the truth written there. "Tell me what must be done." Elena explained in a quiet voice that your blood carries immunity to the virus because we are both human and elf, and the world tree can use our blood to create antibodies and purify itself. Carter stepped forward, and his face was pale. "How much blood?" Marcus met his father's gaze, and the truth passed between them without words. All of it. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of poison spreading through the world tree's veins as its leaves began to wither and fall. Kane laughed, and the sound echoed off ancient walls. "Even if you try this, it will fail because one child's blood cannot save something so vast, and by the time you realize that it will be too late. Shadowfang moved then, and the ancient dragon placed his massive head against Elena's small form, and his voice filled every mind present. There is another way, because dragon blood carries immortal essence, and combined with the children, it might be enough. Valeria looked at her oldest friend and companion of countless centuries. If you do this, it will drain you, and you might not survive. The dragon's eyes gleamed with ancient wisdom and something that might have been love. I am old beyond measure, and I have lived longer than any dragon should, and if my final act saves two species and binds three together, then it is a worthy death. Starfire stepped forward, and her younger voice joined Shadowfang's. Will help, and together we are stronger. Frostwind and Ember moved to stand with the other dragons, and their voices harmonized. We all help, because this is why we chose these children. The four dragons surrounded Elena and Marcus, and their combined power began to glow like a star being born. Liana sobbed as she held her children one last time. You do not have to do this. Elena smiled through her tears. Yes, we do, because this is why we exist, and we are the bridge between worlds. Marcus took his sister's hand. Together the dragon's magic flowed into the children, and their blood began to change and transform into something new and powerful. Carter moved to join them, but Liana grabbed his arm. If the children give their blood, then we must too, because we are family, and we share this burden. She looked at her mother, and Valeria understood. 3 generations. Carter nodded and stepped forward to place his hands on his children's shoulders as Liana did the same, and Valeria joined them to complete the circle. The magic intensified, and blood began to flow from the family into channels that led directly to the world tree's roots. Kane watched in horror as his programming warred with buried memories. This is not how it was supposed to end, but the magic reached out and touched him too, and the burst of purified life force shattered the mental conditioning that had held him prisoner for 20 years. Kane Brooks fell to his knees and screamed as he remembered everything he had done and everyone he had killed. Under the Dominion's control, the world tree drank deeply of the offered blood and dragon essence, and slowly the poison retreated as new life flooded through. Ancient wood leaves that had withered began to grow again, and roots that had blackened with death pulsed with renewed vigor. But the family was dying, and their life force draining away even as they saved an entire civilization. Shad felt his immortal essence flowing out, and he knew he had given too much and there would be no recovery. With his last strength, the ancient dragon made a choice. He had lived for thousands of years and accumulated power beyond measure, and now he gave it all back. The dragon's essence split and flowed into each member of the family and stabilized their life force while completing the transformation. The world tree blazed with light that could be seen across the entire planet, and magic surged through elven space like a tidal wave of renewal. When the light faded, the family stood breathing and alive, while around them the world tree was healed completely. But Shadowfang lay still, and his eyes were closed, and his breathing had stopped. Valeria collapsed beside her ancient friend, and grief poured from her in waves. In the sky above, Dominion ships suddenly lost power and fell from orbit as Kane transmitted their command codes and overrides to the Imperial fleet. Kane walked to Carter and fell to his knees. What have I done? Carter placed a hand on his old friend's shoulder. You survived, and now you help us make it right. 3 months passed, and the galaxy slowly learned to breathe again as the Dominion of Ash crumbled from within. When Kane Brooks transmitted everything he knew about their operations and secret bases and command structures, the war that had consumed countless worlds for decades ended not with a final battle, but with revelations that destroyed the enemy from the inside. Imperial forces and human fleets worked together to liberate worlds that had suffered under Dominion rule, and everywhere they went, the symbol of a dragon carrying an olive branch marked their ships as liberators, not conquerors. In the capital city of the Eternal Court, workers rebuilt what had been destroyed, and the crystal towers rose again, but this time humans walked among the elves as equals and friends rather than strangers. Carter Blake stood on a balcony overlooking the reconstruction, and beside him Kane worked through guilt that would never fully heal. You saved billions of lives when you transmitted those codes. Kane shook his head and his eyes were haunted. I also killed thousands before I remembered who I was, and no amount of good deeds will wash that blood away. Before Carter could respond, Liana joined them, and her presence brought warmth that eased some of Cain's pain. The Empress has called for us, and the ceremony begins soon. The three humans walk through halls that had once been forbidden to any but pure elves and now children of mixed heritage, played in gardens where ancient nobles discussed philosophy and war. Elena and Marcus ran past them with Frostwind and Ember flying overhead in their smaller forms because young dragons could shift their size until they reached full maturity. The children have become heroes to both species, and songs were already being written about the half-human, half-elf twins who saved the world. Treba Carter saw the weight his children carried, and how they sometimes woke from nightmares remembering the moment they thought they would they reached the throne room where Empress Valeria waited, and beside her stood an empty space where Shadowfang should have been. The great dragon's sacrifice had become legend, and statues were being raised across the empire to honor the Ancient One who gave everything to bind three species together. The throne room filled with nobles and warriors and diplomats from 100 worlds, including human ambassadors who had never imagined such a gathering would be possible. Commander Iris Thornwood stood with the dragon riders, and she wore a medal that Carter had given her personally for valor in battle. Beside her stood former enemies, who now worked together to ensure the fragile peace would last. Valeria rose from her throne, and silence fell across the assembly as her voice carried to every corner. We gather here to acknowledge what was done and what was sacrificed and what was gained in the battle for our survival. She gestured to Liana and her family. My daughter left us 20 years ago, and I thought she had abandoned her duty and her people, but I was wrong. Liana returned not as a traitor, but as a bridge between worlds, and she brought with her a human who taught us that honor without victory is merely death. With pride Carter bowed, but Valeria raised her hand. You do not bow to me, Carter Blake, because you are family, and family stands as equal. She turned to address the assembly. I asked my daughter a question when she returned, and the answer was delayed by war and sacrifice, but now I ask again before all witnesses. Valeria looked at Elena and Marcus, who stood tall despite their youth. Are these my grandchildren? Lian stepped forward, and her voice rang clear. Yes, Mother, and they are my children, and Carter's children, and they are humanity's children, and they are the Empire's children. They belong to all of us, and they represent what we can become when we choose unity over division. The Empress nodded slowly, and then she smiled. Then the first claimed them as heirs to the throne, and I recognize all unions between humans and elves as legitimate and blessed by ancient law. The assembly erupted in cheers, and some voices raised in protest, but the cheers drowned them out. Valeria raised her hand again for silence. There are those who say this dilutes our bloodline and makes us weaker, but I say we have seen the truth. She pointed to Elena and Marcus. These children bonded with wild dragons, and they carry immunity to weapons designed to destroy us, and their blood saved the world tree when pure elven magic could not. If that is weakness, then I pray we become weaker still. Iris stepped forward and spoke with conviction that surprised everyone. I fought beside Carter Blake, and I watched him command our forces with skill that saved countless lives. I am old and proud, and I believed humans were beneath us, but I was wrong, and anyone who still believes that is a fool. One by one, the dragon rider stepped forward and knelt before Carter and Liana and their children. We swear to protect this family and to honor the bond between our peoples. Elena felt tears streaming down her face because she had spent her whole life hiding what she was, and now she was being celebrated for it. Marcus took his sister's hand, and together they approached their grandmother. We want to honor Shadowfang, because without him we would not be here, and the Empire would be dead. Valeria's eyes glistened with unshed tears. How would you honor him? Marcus spoke clearly, so all could hear. By making sure his sacrifice meant something, and by being worthy of what he gave us. The Empress embraced her grandchildren, and for the first time in 3 centuries, she wept openly. Shadfang would be proud. The ceremony continued with speeches and celebrations, but Carter found himself drawn to a quiet garden, where a simple stone marked the place where the ancient dragon had been laid to rest. Cain found him there, and the 2 old friends stood in silence for a long moment. Do you think it was worth it? Carter looked at the memorial and then back toward the palace where his children laughed with elven nobles and human diplomats alike. Yes, And every drop of blood and every moment of pain led to this, and I would do it all again. Cain nodded slowly. The Dominion bred me to hate and to destroy, but watching those children, I remember why I fought in the first place, to protect the future, give them a chance we never had. Movement in the shadows caught their attention, and Starfire emerged from the garden's edge. The dragon approached Shadowfang's memorial and laid a single golden scale upon the stone. His voice echoes in his children and his children's children, and he is not truly gone. Carter felt a presence brush against his mind, and for just a moment he heard Shadowfang's deep rumble. Take care of them, young human, and make sure my sacrifice was not in vain. Then the presence faded, and Carter was left with only memory and determination inside. The Palace Valeria stood before a star map that showed both the Elven Empire and human territories marked in different colors. Liana joined her mother and studied the map. What are you thinking? Valeria smiled, and it was an expression of hope rather than calculation. I am thinking that we have been alone too long, and isolation made us weak. She gestured to the vast spaces between stars. There are other species out there and other civilizations, and perhaps it is time we reached out as friends rather than conquerors. Liana nodded. A true alliance, and not just between elves and humans. Exactly, and with Elena and Marcus as living proof that different species can not only coexist, but thrive together. The Empress looked at her daughter. You did something I could never do, and you risked everything for a hope I could not see. I am sorry I doubted. Juliana embraced her mother. You made the hard choices when it mattered, and that is all anyone can ask outside the palace. Elena and Marcus flew their dragons through the twilight sky, and below them 2 civilizations began the long work of building something new. The children dove and spun and laughed with pure joy because they were alive, and they were free, and they were loved. Frostwind's voice entered their minds. What do you wish to do now, little ones? Marcus grinned. Everything, Elena added, and we will do it together. The dragons roared their agreement, and the sound echoed across the capital as the twin moons rose over a galaxy forever changed. 5 years passed, and the Eternal Court had transformed into something no one could have imagined. When Empress Valeria first asked her question about grandchildren, the crystal towers still reached toward the stars, but now they housed not just elves but humans and a dozen other species who had joined the growing alliance that spread across the galaxy. Like wildfire, Elena and Marcus were 13 and 15 now, and they had grown into their roles as bridges between worlds with confidence that came from being loved rather than feared. The girl sat in a council chamber surrounded by diplomats twice her age, and she translated between human efficiency and elven tradition with ease that made negotiations flow smoothly. Her brother worked with military commanders to design new defense strategies that combined the best of multiple species approaches to warfare. But today was special because today marked the 5th anniversary of the day the World Tree was saved, and the entire capital prepared for celebrations that would last a week. Carter Blake walked through the palace gardens with Iris Thornwood, and the old dragon rider had become one of his closest friends over the years. She gestured to workers hanging decorations and setting up stages for performances. Your children have done more in 5 years than most accomplish in a lifetime. Carter watched Elena directing a group of young elves and humans who were organizing relief supplies for distant colonies. They had no choice but to grow up fast because the galaxy was watching everything they did. Iris nodded thoughtfully. They remain children in the ways that matter, and they still laugh and play and dream of adventure. Beyond duty, a commotion at the palace gates drew their attention, and a ship was landing that bore markings neither of them recognized. Guards moved to intercept, but Valeria's voice echoed across the courtyard. Let them approach. A delegation emerged from the ship, and they were tall beings with crystalline skin that reflected light in rainbow patterns. Carter had never seen their species before, but he recognized the diplomatic insignia they wore. The crystalline leader bowed to Valeria, who had come to greet them personally. Great Empress, and we are the Luminar Collective, and we have traveled far to see if the stories we heard were true. Valeria inclined her head. What stories would those be? Luminar gestured to the mixed crowd that filled the courtyard where elves and humans and others worked side by side, that different species can truly unite, and that children of mixed blood walk among you as honored rather than scorned. Elena and Marcus appeared at their grandmother's sighed, and the Luminar stared at them with wonder. These are the saviors we heard of in distant systems. Marcus smiled shyly. We just did what needed to be done. The Luminar leader knelt, which shocked everyone present because their species was notoriously proud. We have warred with the Dominion for centuries and lost countless worlds to their hatred. When we heard they fell because of an alliance between former enemies, we thought it was propaganda, but now we see the truth. Please teach us how you achieved this miracle. Valeria looked at her grandchildren and then at the assembled crowd. It was no miracle, but simply a choice to see strength in difference rather than weakness, the choice to put survival above pride. Ileana stepped forward with Carter beside her. It began with one elf and one human who chose love over fear, and it continues with every person who decides that working together serves everyone better than fighting alone. The Luminar delegation looked at each other, and then their leader spoke with quiet determination. The Luminar collective wishes to join your alliance. Over the following weeks, more species arrived, and each brought stories of how news of the United Empire had spread across the galaxy. Some came seeking refuge from wars, and others came offering trade and knowledge, and all came hoping to find what had been created here. The alliance grew, and with it came challenges that no one had anticipated. Not everyone celebrated unity, and there were factions within both human and elven societies that resented the changes. Protests erupted on some worlds, and violence flared in isolated incidents as extremists on both sides tried to destroy what had been built. Elena found herself mediating disputes between humans who felt their culture was being erased and elves who feared losing their ancient traditions. Marcus worked with security forces to prevent terrorist attacks from those who wanted to return to the old ways of separation and mistrust. One night, Carter found his son standing alone on a balcony and staring at the stars with troubled eyes. It is harder than I thought it would be. Carter joined him and put an arm around Marcus's shoulders. What is making peace and making it last? Because there's always someone who wants to tear it down. His father nodded slowly. That is the price of building something new, and there will always be resistance to change. But look at what we have accomplished already. He gestured to the city below, where lights from 1,000 different cultures created a tapestry of unity. 5 years ago, humans and elves barely spoke, and now we govern together and raise families together and dream together. Marcus smiled slightly. Grandmother says you taught her that honor without victory is just death with pride. Carter chuckled. I may have said something like that in the heat of battle, but does it mean that sometimes the hardest choice is also the right choice, and that true strength comes from knowing when to fight and when to build bridges? The boy thought about this and then asked the question that had been weighing on him. Do you think Shadowfang would be proud of what we have done? Carter felt that familiar presence brush against his mind, and he knew the ancient dragon watched still through his children and through the magic that bound all living things. I know he would be proud because you and your sister represent everything he believed in: unity and sacrifice and hope for a better future. Elena appeared behind them with Frostwind in miniature form, perched on her shoulder. Grandmother wants us, and she says it is important. The family gathered in Valeria's private chambers, where the Empress stood before the same star map she had studied 5 years ago, but now it was marked with dozens of new alliance members and trade routes that connected worlds that had never spoken before. I am old, and even with dragon magic sustaining me, I feel the weight of centuries. She turned to face her family. It is time to name my successor. Liana started to protest, but Valeria held up her hand. Not you, my daughter, because you have your own work to do. She looked at Elena and Marcus. The empire will be led by both of you together when you come of age. Until then, I will rule with you at my side, learning what it means to govern. The children stared in shock, but Carter felt pride and fear war in his chest. They are so young. Valeria smiled. They saved the world tree at 8 and 10 years old, and they have negotiated treaties and commanded respect from beings 10 times their age. They are ready. And more importantly, the galaxy needs to see that the future belongs to those who were born from unity, not division. Over the next months, Elena and Marcus began their training as future rulers, and they learned statcraft from their grandmother and military strategy from Iris and diplomacy from their mother, and the 1,000 small skills needed to hold an empire together. But they also remained children, and they flew their dragons through the stars and explored ancient ruins and fell in Love with the infinite possibilities that the galaxy offered. Kane Brooks worked tirelessly to make amends for his time under Dominion control, and he established schools across Alliance space where former enemies learned to work together. He never fully forgave himself, but he found purpose in building rather than destroying. One day a messenger arrived with news that the last Dominion stronghold had fallen, and the war was truly over. The capital erupted in celebration, and Carter stood with Lyanna watching their children address the crowd with confidence and grace. We did it. Lyanna leaned against her husband. We started it, but they will finish it, and the future they build will be greater than anything we imagined. Valeria stood at her throne with Starfire beside her, and she thought of Shadowfang and all the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. In the garden where the ancient dragon rested, his memorial had been expanded into a place of reflection where people of all species came to honor those who gave everything for peace. Elena and Marcus visited often, and they laid flowers and told Shadowfang about their victories and their struggles. On the 5th anniversary of his sacrifice, they stood before his memorial with hundreds gathered behind them. Elena spoke. First, you gave us life when we should have died, and you gave us purpose when we felt lost. Marcus continued. We promise to honor your memory by building a galaxy where no one has to sacrifice everything just to survive together. They placed a golden scale upon the memorial, and it glowed with inner light as dragon magic recognized the offering. For just a moment, everyone present felt Shadowfang's presence, and his voice echoed in their minds. You have done well, little ones, and the future is yours to shape. Build it with wisdom and courage and love. Then he was gone, and only memory remained. But it was enough. The celebration continued into the night, and as the twin moons rose, Carter found himself back in the garden with Valeria. The Empress looked at the memorial and smiled. He knew this would happen, and he saw the future we could build if we had the courage to reach for it. Do you think we succeeded? Carter thought about his children and the Alliance and the countless lives that had been saved. Yes, but the work is never finished, and there will always be new challenges. Valeria nodded.